Papers for Printmaking was a videotape made in 1984. I made it with Kathleen Rabel, who at that time was a graduate student at the University of Washington School of Art, and she was also teaching at the Cornish College of Art. So it was a co-venture among the UW, Cornish College, and myself, and now it's in the Ritchie's video archives. So enjoy the view.
Before you actually start, because the machines have to wind up.
I also bought some Incisione and some blue.
We're at Daniel Smith Ink Company in Seattle. My name is Bill Ritchie, and this is Kathleen Rabel, KR, as she's sometimes known. And we're going to make a videotape this morning about buying papers for printmaking. Actually, they sell a lot of papers for watercolor as well. We have with us also the silkscreen class from the University of Washington School of Art, winter of 1984. What we'll be going over today is the things to keep in mind when you buy papers for printmaking or papers for any art class. It's a kind of introduction for a consumer who isn't familiar with papers, fine papers in particular, where they come from, why there are so many kinds, and most importantly, how to get the best for your dollar. Let's just suppose that you live in an isolated place and you don't know where to go for paper. You probably will be doing mail order, but where do you start? I thought it would be helpful to point out every printmaking book has sources of supply or a supplier's list in the back, or periodicals, books on printmaking or art books. They also carry lists of directory or supply lists in the back of their magazines. And also inside of periodicals, there will be advertisements, supply sources. Daniel Smith Incorporated in Seattle, of course, can be found in these kinds of periodicals. That's your first opening to get into a mail order or bulk order for paper. When you write to the company, naturally you can get a catalog, such as this one. And when you have the catalog, you'll find a section on papers. You'll find them usually grouped according to whether they're from the West or whether they're from Japan, Korea, or China. Here's a typical entry, for example. This is for Arches 88. This is a silkscreen paper. It was designed for silkscreen. What I mean is the company was receiving requests from screen print artists who weren't happy with having to use etching papers for their silkscreens. So the company, realizing that there was a big new market opening up here, built a new formula and designed a process, and they ended up with Arch 88. So this is what it says. A very white, smooth sheet is often referred to as 88 silkscreen because of this initial development for silkscreen printing, just as I said. It will be Waterleaf, no sizing, so that makes it very absorbent. The ink is going to sit, well into the fiber, whereas if it were sized, it would tend to sit on top of the fibers, and so on. So you see, most catalogs will include some kind of statement that gives the buyer a chance to judge it sight unseen. Yeah, the cost of these papers ranges from about 86 cents on up to about $12 a sheet. Now, the price list, of course, will show you that. The distinction is a sheet of Zan, which is handmade, one sheet at a time, could run around $4.50 to $6 for a European paper. Americans this year, 1984, are tending to charge even more than Europeans. So a handmade sheet of paper from Twin Rocker could run $8.50 to $11 a sheet.
And usually the sheets that are actually dipped by hand, that are handmade, are more expensive. But there are beautiful papers that are machine-made that function beautifully, are beautiful sheets in themselves.
Okay. Now, here we have an example of Fabriano Classico. It's just a paper I picked because it's on this page. You have several columns showing the price breakdown. That's sometimes confusing to a beginning purchaser of papers. It means that the more you buy, the less you pay per sheet. If you buy 1,000 sheets, now of course most people don't buy 1,000, but just take that for an example. At 1,000 sheets, you would pay $1.36 per sheet. Whereas if you only bought one sheet, you would pay $2.75. That's how you read these charts. You usually have 4 or 5 options, so you pick them out. If you buy 500 sheets, you pay $1.40 compared to $1.36. So naturally, if you can buy 100 sheets, you're better off price-wise to buy at the rate of 100-sheet rate. Another option is that when you buy papers in bulk, these catalogs will explain to you how you can mix your order. So you can buy 100 sheets of that one, 100 sheets of this one, 100 sheets of another, and end up with a 500-sheet rate if you bought 5 times.
Well, I think paper is an exciting thing to work with for an artist because you do have a palette of texture, of color, and then the hidden function of the sheet. And you have papers from all over the world. And I think that we're especially fortunate to be able to order through Dan Smith because he has such a great selection. And that if you do want to order 1 or 2 sheets, you can. You don't have to order tremendous quantities. Before Dan Smith, we would have to order from New York and order quite large quantities. So
I have some sample books to show.
Okay.
Inside these folders, we have sample books for papers. Now, they don't give these away because each one is handmade from examples of the paper in stock, currently in stock. They're not bound together like a book might be, but each one is a substantial size piece of paper showing you what they have in stock. These run several dollars when you buy them, but they're indispensable. It's a good time for someone just starting printmaking is to buy one from the outset. But remember that in maybe 5 or 6 years, some of these may be obsolete, no longer available. You get dozens of sheets of examples from their so-called printmaking section when you order a print sample book. Of course, printmaking isn't the only paper for which they supply. They also supply text papers for bookbinding and for calligraphy. So there's an envelope full of calligraphy and text weight papers. A printmaker learns very soon, particularly in silk screen printing and woodcut, that even lightweight papers, which you might not have thought would be suitable for printmaking, lightweight text papers are quite good. This also is true of watercolor papers if you're in an etching class. So sample books for watercolor would also be useful. These are all watercolor papers, typically heavily sized and textured, but can be used for printing etching since you use an etching press.
Also, when you're buying watercolor papers, you'll find that it will say, and with the sized papers, that the finish on the sheet, it might say it's rough, cold pressed, or hot pressed. And the hot pressed you'll find is the smoothest surface. It's calendared, or the surface is finished with hot metal rollers.
So it's the smoothest, it's the smoothness of the surface that you're...
Hot press is the smoothest, then comes cold pressed, and then rough. So I've actually brought in 3 sheets of the same paper with a different finish, so you can see the difference.
It's all the same kind of paper, same recipe,
right.
Same making process, but after it's made, it's pressed hot. This is hot metal surface, I think, isn't it, that they do? That's like ironing it.
Right. Cold pressed is finished with cold metal plate.
And then rough would be the natural, what I would call natural off the mold surface. Yeah, okay, not heavily pressed. This is something else that's interesting. This is unusual. These are called Botanical Papers, and Daniel Smith is also carrying these. These are all handmade papers, 1 sheet at a time, and they're made from unusual ingredients. Willow, yucca, straw, I suppose that's wheat straw, cattail, and cedar. It's a very unusual special effects paper. So if you're interested in special effects, or if you have techniques at your disposal to do laminating, these special papers might be interesting. What I've tried to promote in my classes is the buying of 5 to 10 different kinds of paper in a whole assemblage, a collection.
To have a palette, yeah.
To have a palette of paper, that's exactly right. And they usually spend from $16 to $28 just to buy this small collection of full-size sheets. Fortunately, most papers come 22 by 30, 26 by 40 inches. And when you're beginning, frequently you're working in not very large sizes, so there are really 4 sheets in one of these sheets of paper. So even if you spent $2 for this, it really comes down to 50 cents. So if cost is a factor that you're concerned about, you don't need to be too worried about the cost, even though it sounds like a lot of money. The amount you learn from having worked with all kinds of paper is worth a lot more than what you've paid for this piece of paper. And it goes without saying that you're going to create artworks on it that are worth far more than 50 cents. So study the catalog carefully. So that's an important thing about buying papers in bulk, either by mail or, if you live in a big city, over the counters, to buy the largest quantity you can. KR, how do you do that at Cornish?
Usually students get together and sign up on a list, and then we have a large quantity of paper and collect the money, and someone brings it down to Dan Smith, brings it back, and then pass out the paper.
Right.
So groups of people get together and order large quantities and get a break in price.
Yeah. I think it would be helpful now to concentrate on the distinctions among papers for specific processes. If you're a lithography worker in lithography, or a student for lithography, what would you look for? If you were a woodcut student, what would you look for? These kinds of things. You've taught those techniques,
right.
And so what's your advice, say, for woodcut?
Well, generally speaking, I like to mix up the paper. I mean, I don't like to really put them in categories. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I brought an example of a Japanese woodcut done on a European paper. Okay. It is a Waterleaf, so therefore, since Japanese woodcut is an aqueous media, that means a water-soluble medium, that it marries very well with a Waterleaf paper. No sizing. They want to join together.
So you're saying that it would be a little misleading to categorize these papers.
I think so.
I see.
Yeah.
I see what you mean. My original idea in coming here was that we would be able to break down our catalog into these little categories to say, well, if you're in silkscreen, then you ought to buy these. But what we've learned in talking to Kathleen is that you really shouldn't think that way. I do know, however, that if you try to print on a heavily sized paper with a Japanese water-based printing process, you're going to have some special effects, shall we call them.
Yes.
Some people might see them as problems, because again, the sizing content in the paper is going to resist the soaking of the color into the paper. So the art student, or the person beginning to learn print process or watercolor, is still required to know what sizing does when it comes to paper.
Well, I would say, generally speaking, intaglio definitely is printed with a damp sheet of paper. Silk screen with dry, and generally speaking, lithography with a dry sheet of paper. I think it's difficult to print a lithograph on a heavily textured sheet of paper, and I have not done very many silk screens, but I would say that texture would be somewhat of a difficulty in silk screen.
That's true. And what most people don't realize is that there's actually a recipe in that paper that's giving it the characteristics that they want. I've asked to show another item that I saw just came up in the last catalog that I noticed it for the first time, the Lee McDonald paper-making kit that Daniel Smith sells also. This is kind of an interesting item. I'm not going to open it, but it contains everything you need to make paper. It contains the pulp in a dehydrated form, a dry form, and it contains the screen and the decal, similar in purpose or principle to the one that KR brought in. plus the wool blankets that you'll need for pressing the paper. And I don't know what that is on the bottom. Must be blotters or something. But this kit comes complete and, of course, includes directions as to how to make your own paper. This is an excellent experience for people to build their awareness, to build a person's awareness as to how or what goes into paper, why papers are so complicated as a subject. But maybe we should go on then to how papers get made, or some of the characteristics of made papers. You brought in some equipment to show that.
Well, I thought maybe I would define true paper being actually made of rags, straw, fibers that are actually macerated into individual units. So those fibers join when they're in the pulp stage, and when they're dry, they're permanently together. So true paper would be that of being individual fibers in units, where the Egyptians, using papyrus, was actually sliced stock, or the tapa cloth was actually pounded bark. So true paper has a special definition. The Japanese call handmade paper washi, and usually made from shrubs, from Mitsumata, Kozo, and Gampe.
Whereas the Western papers are mostly cotton and linen,
right,
or combinations,
right.
And in both countries they're throwing a lot of wood pulp in too.
Okay, also in a handmade sheet of paper, you'll have two sides of the sheet, and you have a screen side and a felt side, and I don't usually like to call them the right or the wrong side, but usually you will work or draw or print on the felt side of the paper. So the pulp, even though we're not making paper today, pretend there's pulp on this, and it gets couched or laid onto a piece of felt. So therefore you have a screen side of the sheet and then a felt side. And it's especially important the way that the Oriental papers are sized, if they are sized. They're sized with fish glue and alum, and that is brushed onto the back of the sheet. So with Oriental papers, you'll have a very smooth side, and that's where they are drying against plywood. And then you'll have a very rough side, that's the back side, and that's where it is sized. And so they're really designed to be used on the front of the sheet, because some of the sizing comes through and stops right at the right moment in the sheet. And you'll find, I think, with handmade papers that they have individual names, just like we do, and you can identify them by the name. I want to show a print by Bill Ritchie called Three Bushes, which also demonstrates the use of chincolé. Here he has printed this on a German paper called Copperplate Deluxe, and chincolé, a Japanese paper called Kitakata. And chincolé also allows you to add a color or a texture without adding another plate or another matrix. And also on the back, he lined down a sheet of the same size so that the paper would stay very flat. It would not buckle when it dried.
Okay. Because there would have been too much tension if the paper had been only on one side, so that the two working together, it cancels out all stresses. That's the chincolé process. It's interesting to comment, too, that the copper plate is a European paper and the other is a Japanese paper. They're very well suited to each other. You can laminate the two together, too, but I always thought that was interesting.
Now, the paper used for chincolé is a Chinese paper, and it's called Gampe Gauzen, and it's very thin, and the Chinese tend to ship their paper like fabric. It doesn't come flat, it actually comes in a bolt. And this is one full sheet of Gampe Gauzen.
Now, this is a vegetable fiber paper.
Right.
Yeah, as compared to a wood pulp or cotton or linen. And since it's made in the Far East, it's probably made of one of those plants that you mentioned earlier.
Right. So, and it's unsized. It does not have any glue in the paper, so therefore You can call that Waterleaf. It's a paper without sizing. And that means that it takes moisture very rapidly. It's like a sponge. It really wants to take that moisture. And you'll find that many of the Japanese and Chinese and Oriental papers are unsized. Some are sized, but most are unsized. I brought in a print by Dan Smith. It's a lithograph. It's done on a water leaf. There's not very much texture in the paper. It's very white. On the back, he is stenciled in watercolor. And because it's a waterleaf paper and takes moisture, that this watercolor travels through to the front of the print. So you get a hint of color coming through.
So there is a little color from that back actually coming through the black litho ink.
Right. And that's I brought this in to explain the quality of a paper being waterleaf that travels through the sheet. If it were a sized sheet, you wouldn't get that color coming through. On the same paper, I brought an etching called Sony Frame 100, and it's an intaglio print by myself. And after the intaglio black is printed, a stencil is put right on the paper, and then a sponge full of watercolor is run over that stencil, so that has watercolor on the front.
That's from the front. This one isn't coming from the back, but it's a waterleaf paper.
Yes, same paper. I want to show a Japanese paper called Kitakata, and you can see the lines running through. It was actually made on a laid mold. It's called a laid mold, where you had either strips of bamboo or wood, and then they're bound together by wires. Where this mold that we're looking at here is called a wool mold, where it's like screen, equal distances between the wires.
Papers are made on screens somewhat like this. And a watermark, this screen doesn't have a watermark, but a watermark can be created by soldering or weaving or simply laminating a small design on the screen. Because when paper's made, it's created by the pulp laying over the screen, and where that watermark is, and I can just see the watermark here faintly, a design will be created where that design is in the wire, and that's called a watermark. I'm going to hold this up and try to get the watermark. Most fine papers will have a watermark, usually along the edge or in the corner. You'll see that, of course, on currency and in some kinds of fine writing papers. There'll be a watermark right in the center. A lot of them are fake. The real ones were created by a design in the screen.
And some are actually embossed into the sheet, too. And on that screen there is a frame it's called the Deco. And it actually keeps the pulp from coming off the edge of the screen. And so on handmade sheets, this rather lacy edge is where the pulp has gone under the screen, and it's called the Deco. So that's what you're seeing. You're seeing the decal edge on the sheet of paper.
What about offset printing? Machine or very fast running processes. Do you know about people using these fine papers on an offset press?
I know well the Lenox 100, if the decals are trimmed off and there's a quantity of paper, it's very good for offset lithography.
An offset printing press takes dozens, sometimes hundreds of sheets of paper just to get started. So it's not kind of economics that you'd want to deal with. There is a factor that a lot of offset presses are small, so a large piece of paper, again, would get cut down to small pieces. Another interesting thing, what about the electronic printing process?
Right. If you have a handmade sheet or a beautiful sheet of paper rather than the typical Xeroxing sheets, that pigment will sit on top of the surface and visually be so much more beautiful than the regular bond that goes through the machine. I found that especially in the black Xerox in the late 60s, that the handmade sheets, the carbon would sit on top of the surface, almost like an etching. And very beautiful.
Interesting thing is that handmade papers can be used in these highly automated printing processes. What about colored papers? Buying colored papers. There's black paper, for
Right, there's
example.
Arche black.
Arche black, and I think some Italian black papers.
Well, this is the charcoal sheet.
These
I
are
think
the
it's
charcoal sheets.
The ong.
And these would be suitable for text?
Yes, or drawing, I suppose. White pastel. This is the Arche black.
I'll say this.
Which is a Waterleaf. Yeah.
I'll say this about colors. Generally, the brighter the color, the less permanent it is. We don't have examples of bright papers here because the company knows that those colors will probably fade. Also, many of the colors that you can buy are water soluble. If the paper has to be dampened, it's all going to soak out or run out on your print. So at best, brightly colored and heavily dyed papers are good for temporary or experimental works, or let's say painting using collage techniques. But for printing and for watercolor, you might have some problems with them. But for the person making paper, color is an exciting area because you can buy the dyes in small bottles and add them to the paper pulp that you're building. And then you come out with your own colored paper. And that in itself is like the glaze is to the ceramic artist. It's part of their palette. That's a good question. It was asked, what does pH neutral mean? Most compounds have either a basic character or an acid character. And this is measurable by a litmus test, isn't it? And as I remember my chemistry, a pH of 7 was neutral. And a pH of 5-6 was getting acid. And a pH of 9 was getting basic. In the arts, we're concerned with permanence. When we create a picture on Thursday, we want it to look the same the next Thursday. Whereas if you get a newspaper off your doorstep that's been out there for an hour in the sun, it's turned brown in an hour.
To break down that cellulose, they have to add so many chemicals.
Yeah, sulfuric acid, among others.
Right.
And this reacts with the sunlight, and you get it burns the cellulose. So you don't want your artwork burning itself up. And every artist who's educated about papers looks for the pH factor. They assume, and I think it's safe to assume, that if a company like this is selling papers for printmaking, that the pH factor is going to be reasonable, and therefore maintain its whiteness or its original color, and it's not going to adversely affect all the colors that you apply to it. So we look frequently for the pH factor. Let's see if the catalog is going to have a reference to that. Where do you see it?
Well, I'm looking at one right
Oh, I see.
See them down here.
It'll say a neutral pH. Well, neutral pH means that it's somewhere, around 7. Plus, you can buy kits from library suppliers where you just take a little eyedropper of this fluid, and if it turns blue, it's one direction. If it turns another color, it's the other direction. Red? Red and blue. Yeah. One factor I think I should mention, too, is that when you handle papers, they must always be picked up with 2 hands. This is a factor that few people know about, because by picking a paper up with one hand, you can cause a damage. I'll use the back of this cover. By picking a piece of paper up, you create a cockle, a little broken place. It's called a cockle, or a wink. You see, and it won't go away. It's true also of fine papers, that by picking them up with one hand, you could damage them seriously. So always with 2 hands, and hold it in a U shape. If you are a person buying paper for other people, and it's your task to sort the paper and spread it out and so forth, you could ruin everybody's paper simply by picking them up with one hand and not practicing that kind of care. Again, we were at Daniel Smith Ink Company in Seattle, and we've talked now at length about buying papers for printmaking, or art, or watercolor in general. And we've tried to give you an overview of what to look for, some of the factors for purchasing paper for silkscreen, for watercolor, for woodcut, lithography, etching, those kinds of factors. The important thing to keep in mind is that the individual buying the paper still must experiment and try out the papers, judge for themselves, finally, what they want to use. I want to thank the screen print class this morning, Art 349 at the University of Washington, because it's by their presence that makes this videotape possible. The staff at IMS TV at the University of Washington, Kathleen Rabel from the Cornish School of Allied Arts, an artist herself, and my name was Bill Ritchie. Thank you.